The time is January 1991, where director David Cronenberg creates a surreal hallucinatory adaptation based on William S Burroughs' controversial novel. The story follows Bill Lee, played by Peter Weller, a writer and exterminator who becomes trapped in a nightmarish world of addiction, paranoia, and bizarre conspiracies. After accidentally killing his wife, he flees to the strange city of Interzone, where he encounters insect-like creatures, secret agents, and a twisted government plot. As his reality blurs, Bill struggles to unravel the mystery of his wife's death while spiraling deeper into madness. This week on Back to the Balcony, we cover the love it, hate it, or what in the hell did I just witness film, Naked Lunch.
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony.
You know, I think a majority of us can agree on something. The ambition, the filmmaking, the direction, all of that falls in line with a visionary filmmaking. But it's vision of what we are seeing unfold on screen that really dives into the psyche of uncomfortable. This is what makes a viewer wonder if they should like this movie or not. And I think that is a bigger conversation than what this movie is all about. I gotta say, during the rewatch and when I picked this movie, I had to really pause and think about it if I really wanted to go through the experience again. And it's not because it's a bad movie, it's not. But it's because of just the pure visuals we see happening, the really in-depth filmmaking to make us feel the way we feel after watching this. And it's one of those movies that I have trouble recommending and saying, you need to watch this movie, because I know I'm always going to get that same response of, what did you make me sit through? Or what in the hell is this? And you know what? To an extent, that's okay, because that is what this movie is all about, to give that WTF of what in the actual fuck is this movie. And this is a hard movie and a nightmare for critics to watch, because they have to balance whether or not this is great filmmaking or if people are really going to like it. This is a pure critic's nightmare, and we're going to get into that in a second. But you know what? I have no clue on your feelings of this movie, and this is one that's really going to pique my curiosity, because I'm going to say this. No matter what this conversation is going to turn into, I will pull in Antonio and say, I appreciate this film.
I mean, I think that's going to be the theme once we get into our critics' take on the film. But yeah, you know me. This is the kind of stuff that I lap up because it's a challenging piece of art. It's a challenging film. And one of the things that makes it challenging is that it is not made to attract audiences per se. We got to do a little bit of history here. Cronenberg really took advantage of the fact that Canada and the Canadian Film Board had all of these tax incentives for filmmakers. So much like the BBC and a lot of films in Eastern Europe, when you see a lot of obscure artistic haute cinema, it's not because a studio thought it was a good idea. It's because governments in other countries support the arts and gave filmmakers money to do essentially whatever the hell they wanted. Which is why when you watch earlier Cronenberg movies, they are so outlandish and out there, because literally no one told him no. And that is exactly why this movie feels so good. In fact, he wanted to make this movie for a studio, and the Canadian Film Board gave him more money if he made it through them. Very rarely do they do that, where they let a filmmaker go to not only another country, another continent on the other side of the world to film parts of his movie. But they had so much pride and success in what Cronenberg did for all the 15, 20 years of filmmaking before this, that they let him do it. And it's that reason, I think, alone that we get this what the fuck movie that you're talking about. It's not my favorite Cronenberg movie, but it's really high up on the list because it exists. A movie like this got made. It exists. It's well made. It is just a fascinating piece of cinema. And the fact that it challenges people makes me love it more, because it's, like I said, it's not meant for the popcorn audiences, and it's not meant for critics. It is meant to be looked at and appreciated the way an abstract piece of art like a Picasso would be, or some like weird, grotesque sculpture in a museum in New York City would be. Now, David Lynch is very similar, but at least David Lynch knows that he's got boundaries for the most part. But Cronenberg doesn't, at least at this particular part of his career. So that's where I stand on this is, yes, I love it because it's challenge. I love it because it's not made for audiences' entertainment. It's meant to be marveled at and recognized. And I don't even want to call it cinema. I want to call it an experience.
It's an experience and an experiment because this one really does push the limits on. We've talked about it before. I hate being spoon fed, and this one really has me torn to an extent. Whereas this one pushes the grotesque images, it gives metaphor after metaphor, and at times it could be a little overwhelming to put the puzzle pieces together on what we're being told on screen. And I'll agree with you. This isn't Cronenberg's my favorite of his, but it is the one that I appreciate the most from his because he actually does go all in on how he wants to tell this adaptation. I haven't read the book, but from what I've heard, it's a fair adaptation to an extent, given the budget and given what can be in cinema. And I do wish that this one would have gone a little bit further when it comes to the visuals if we're going to go all in. But when it comes to how we tackle the dialogue to it, this one is where I really was a little disappointed. Is at one point it's just go, go, go without allowing us to take in and appreciate what we're being shown on screen. And if I were to fault this movie for anything, is not giving us that breaking point of letting us digest the stunning filmmaking visuals that Cronenberg gives us, along with the poetry, I almost want to say, even though it feels dirty calling it poetry in this kind of movie. But there is good dialogue here, but we don't get a moment to really take it in and appreciate the holistic vision that Cronenberg delivers here.
Well, and that's the thing is, like, I'm not even sure if that's his intent. I'm going to humble brag for a second. So, I got to interview Alan Rudolph about him adapting Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut. And much like William S. Burroughs or Ken Casey, he's a very hallucinogenic writer, where the prose don't necessarily mean you're going to get a narrative story. He's really literally just writing out his hallucinations, and it's up to the reader of how they want to interpret that. So with the Burroughs creating the story of, semi-autobiographical things that happened with him, like he in real life shot his wife in a William Tell, put a bottle on your head and let me shoot it thing, which is a big part of this plot. I think that it is up to the filmmaker to, I'm going to say, disseminate whatever the author's words were and try and make them into a story. And it's interesting that you said what you said about the dialogue and about the structure of it. I feel like it is intentionally non-conformative because the novel and the writing isn't. So essentially, you can't just have a visual telling of such a hallucinogenic novel. People do have to say things. There does have to be some kind of plot structure, but I also don't think that needs to be the focus of the film. It just needs to be there to get you from scene to scene and give you more of these crazy visuals, scenarios, and situations. So that's where it's really hard, and we're going to find that out in a little bit. It's very hard to critique that film from that viewpoint of, okay, I appreciate cinema. I go and watch a movie. I love story. I love plot. This movie really has none of that. So, but it's not a bad movie because of it. Again, it's a visual feast. But if anything, I'm going to say, like, not even an experience. It is a vessel of emotional and physical distress. That, I think, is what the intention is. It's almost like a movie that he wants you to taste and smell. He does it with the visuals. He does it with the sound effects. I mean, these living typewriters that are essentially bugs with talking buttholes. It's not the visual that disturbs me. It's the sound of the squishing and the flesh and all of that, like viscera. That is the part that really brings that emotional experience together. So the fact that it doesn't really work as a story, the fact that I can get every emotion, smell, taste, touch, sense, and sound from a visual experience, that's what I think makes this a different story.
Well, I don't know. I mean, having a conversation with an insect's butthole did disturb me a little bit. I'll give it that. But this is where kind of what we spoke to is this is a critic's worst nightmare. And even though I have kind of my nitpicking critiques of how I want to watch a movie, I get it. I understand the vision because when we go into madness, when we go into addiction, we go into the mental state of the noise of creativity. It shouldn't slow down because that's not what this persona is trying to do. It shouldn't slow down. This is where we ride a fine line on storytelling versus intent because the intent is sound. It is there, but the selfish critic in me really wants to say, stop. Let me hit pause. Let me hear that in detail. There is no winning in this movie when it comes to it, unless you have a remote with a pause and a rewind button, because you really do. If you do watch this as a first time view, you are going to have your first moral instincts. You're just kick in saying, gross, I don't like it because I don't understand it. And that's where you really have to commit to this movie of understanding what's being told on screen along side by side with the filmmaker's intent. This isn't, like you said, this isn't just a storytelling aspect of it. This is more than that. This is a filmmaker's vision. This is a book. This is an adaptation. This is a journey into madness and addiction and sexual personas, if you will. So there is so much on the table here that leads to madness that it is one that I literally, during my second rewatch this week, I spent 3 hours pausing and rewinding to grasp not just the intent, but what is being told to me. That is what is, when I said earlier, experimental to this film, is because how many people are going to dedicate a movie that makes you feel so icky by the end of it and really go back and appreciate that? But I'll tell you this, spending 3 hours, well invested, because I appreciated this movie even more because I now have a fuller understanding of what this movie tried to do.
Yeah, I get that too. And for me, I can just absorb it and appreciate it. I mean, for me, it's a litmus test for sure. Like, what is your cinematic capability as a viewer and as appreciator of visual art? So for me, the fact that Peter Weller, who's I think amazing in this movie, he is very subtle. He's underplayed. He's monotone. He doesn't get excited. When people hear about films about addiction and hallucinations, we're expected to see people acting all goofy and crazy, but he doesn't. I mean, it's almost noirish in a sense. He almost feels like an old film noir character. He's not a detective. He's there to be an interzone and essentially be an agent and make reports, One of the things I think that's supposed to represent is it's the same way that like crazy people don't know they're crazy, or people with addictions don't think that they're addicted to anything. It's the people around them that do. And I think that's what his characterization represents, is that he is in the depths and the bowels of addiction, of madness, and of sexual perversion. But in his mind, he's just a tourist. He's just there as an observer. And even though he's partaking, what the characters around him visualize is not what we see his character representation as, because we're watching the movie through his eyes. That's what I think the brilliant part of this is that to him, the surroundings are what's weird. But if we looked at the film from the perspective of the people around him, he's the weirdo. He's the wacko. And that's where I think that fine line of brilliance and madness plays in the way this movie is meant, because you can actually look at it from two different ways. Characters like Ian Holm and Roy Scheider and Judy Davis, on the outside looking in, he's the crazy one. But in his mind and in his narrative, which is the one that we're following, it's inner zone. It's the craziness around him that is the insanity. So it really plays on two different levels. And I'm not saying that you have to be brilliant or a certain type of film viewer to appreciate that. I'm saying once you unlock the movie, it does something different for you as a viewer and I think as a critic.
You have to be a patient viewer on this one because
yeah.
When we start to connect the dots and we get towards the last half of the movie where we get his writing buddies pull him off of a beach to symbolize the down and out of where he's become, that is where I think if you were a normal viewer, that's where you're really going to connect the dots on reflection of where this journey has really gone with Bill. And I think that is where we really think of the setting and the characters really cluing us in on what's really going on. And I think that's a
Mhm.
pivotal moment. It's more of a too brief moment, but it's just enough to really unlock it for a normal audience. And it makes us walking out of the theater just give us that moment of looking at the different characters and how they intersect with Bill's character and how they actually added to his actions, or if they really did add to his actions. Because we really question in my last rewatch if what led to addiction, what was the main journey that put him in this position? Was it the wife? Was it the pressures of creativity? What was it? And I think it's more than just seeing this guy as a junkie or somebody obsessed with drugs or madness. It's more of what led him to that point. And I found that more interesting than the actual piece of madness or addiction is the journey there, what led it there.
That's the other thing I think is brilliant about this movie is not since the 70s and the wave of government conspiracy and paranoia films have I seen a film that is so dedicated to the enhancement of paranoia, but this time adding like visual flair to it and not taking it so seriously that you as a viewer feel paranoid. Like now you feel like the movie is creeping out of your TV screen and into your world, especially if you're tired, man. 'Cause, yeah, I've watched this twice in the last week. Once, during the afternoon while I had the house to myself, and then again with the commentary on the Criterion DVD at like 1 in the morning. And I tell you, when you're tired and your head's not all there, you find yourself almost sucked into the film. It's almost like Cronenberg was doing like a choose your own adventure type story. Like there is an interactivity with this movie if you put yourself in the right mindset. One thing I got to compliment too, other than, Cronenberg being a brilliant director and visualist, is the cast. The cast in this is so good, and it's respectable names. It's Peter Weller, it's Ian Holm, it's Judy Davis, it's Roy Scheider, who's our all-star from last season, right? The thing that makes this film really work is that those people play their roles 100% straight, and they let the environment be the flamboyant and uh, exuberant part of the movie. Their performances are very matter of fact, and I have to say that like as an actor choosing a role, if you were to read this script, it's nonsense. But if you are excited by the prospect of a visual filmmaker doing something so outlandish, I can only imagine certain people being like, "Oh, I got to be a part of this." I don't even know what it's going to look like, but it's fascinating. And I think Ian Holm has been in enough of those kind of movies in the 70s and 80s that it really does show that he had a taste for the offbeat. Doing Terry Gilliam films like Brazil. I mean, doing Brazil and this is just like kind of a little notch in his belt of like working with two of the most visual directors of that era. And then Roy Scheider too, like he is a very interesting choice for this movie, especially with how his character turns up at the end. But he's in it 100%, and that is what makes it, even though it's not believable in the sense of probability, because we're living in a fantasy world in this film. But you feel that character and that performance is valid, and that's what I really liked about him. And then Judy Davis is good in anything, and she kind of plays a dual role here. And it just goes to show that, like, she really was very selective with what roles she picked. And the fact that she's in this movie in two different characters, essentially, is just amazing. And she's a fantastic actress. And I wish we would have had more from her,
100%. What was special about these performances, and you said it earlier, and I thought it was spot on, you stole my line, was the noir feel of it.
Mm.
These are the audio shadows of performances, and they all have the same range. It is all linear and rightfully so. These are the mysterious lines that never go over the top, they never go too below. It's almost like singing in a choir in unison, that they are really just there to support uh, uh, our main character. And when it comes to Roy Schneider, this is where he goes up just a slight octave, where he is a little bit more mysterious, where you can feel that he has a bigger piece of it. And even when his first on screen presence comes on, and we can kind of tell this is going to be a big piece of this movie, and this is going to end up with something bigger towards the climax. And it's not, again, over the top. It's just a slight octave up from the rest of the performances. He separates himself, and this is what's awesome about Roy Schneider, is that he really does know his characters. And we said it in All That Jazz, we've said it numerous times. He knows how to play the part at hand, but not just the part, how to support the story along with the characters. And this one is the perfect example of that, because it is really an important role for him in this film.
I think we also have to talk about the creature effects, you know, for a generally low budget movie in comparison to the things that we were seeing back in 1991. I mean, this is a year of Terminator 2, right? The fact that the Mogwum and the Carl Nova typewriter, they're very practical effects. They're rubber, they're latex, but they're tangible. They feel like you could reach out and touch them and feel the stickiness and sliminess on the skin. There's just something about them so off-putting, and they talk about it in the review, where it doesn't feel like a gremlin or a mogwai or E.T. There's something very organic, almost hyper-organic about them. And this disturbing factor that it brings to it is that not only are the effects so good and so, I'm going to use the word visceral again, the performance of the voices. Peter Beretsky did the voice of the Carl Nova typewriter and of the Mogwum. It's just something that even brings another level to it. So, for example, I just, you haven't seen it yet, but I just saw the Nosferatu movie. And you really don't recognize Bill Skarsgård as the creature, as Orlok, because he's covered under so much makeup. What they rely on is the vocal performance. The vocal performance of that character is what really makes the movie, in my opinion. I feel that way about these creatures, is if they sounded like cartoon characters, if they sounded like a Star Wars character, it would ruin the environment, the atmosphere, and the vibe that Cronenberg was going for. By bringing like this ominous, almost like 1940s news reporter patois to their speech, it really just created a whole new experience of, I know I'm watching a latex character, but I feel like I'm actually listening to and viewing a real organic creature. And that put the disturbing level even higher.
Well, it really does define the method of madness when it comes to it, because these are really raw, brilliantly choreographed creatures that really do look ugly and add to that ugly feeling of watching it. And the voice acting supports that. You can almost visually see it, but you can almost smell the room of how gross these characters are. So it's a
Right.
full-blown experience of how we're feeling when these effects come on board. There isn't a movie that really pushes the limits. Even some monster and horror movies don't go this ugly and dirty to give us that icky feeling. And you're right, because of a lot of the voice actors, and that's the magic of practical effects, is you can strategically place the movements of these creatures, the typewriter keys, however you want to match the voice and the tonage of our voice performers. And I think this is the strongest point of this movie that our critics are going to talk about. And this is what it brilliantly does to really enhance the madness to it, because it does go and push the limits on some of these effects to really put us in the Bill's character, to really follow along with it, to see it through his eyes. We're feeling kind of what he probably is feeling, is gross. What in the hell is going on?
You know, it makes me want to wonder what was in the water or in the air in 1991, because like this movie, it is so it's so visceral, it's so off-putting and esoteric. There's just a lot of I'm searching for words tonight. There is a lot of like, I don't know, metaphysical things going on with it, where it feels like we are dealing with a whole hyper-realistic environment. And then I think about it, the exact same year, pretty much around the exact same time of year, the Coen brothers made their most, I'm going to say, experimental, esoteric, and metaphysical film, and that's Barton Fink. Like Barton Fink to me feels like a milder version of this, where we're watching the wallpaper peel, we see the rooms start on fire, yet the movie is very monotone and underplayed until it gets hyper realistic. There's something about that 1991 vibe that I want to go back and research, because there's probably other films I'm not thinking of as well, but I don't know what it is where these films have a very similar feel. This one just takes it to the grosser factor, because it's a Cronenberg movie. But yeah, I think it's an interesting thing that we have a very familiar vibe going on in that early 90s with films like this. And maybe they overdid it because we did not see many films like this afterwards from other filmmakers. Once we got into that world of T2, Jurassic Park, and Pulp Fiction, the rest of the 90s was nothing but that. So yeah, this is a very special moment in time, in my opinion.
It comes to a scene in the movie where you're rubbing drugs on an insect's butthole mouth that you really say, all right, that's enough. We've seen it all. Let's move on, guys. So that was probably the limit of the 90s, where we didn't see anything at that point that was released in theaters or even dared to be released straight to video that wasn't rated X.
So I before we jump into our critics' reviews, I think the last thing I want to ask you about this movie is this something that you're going to watch again, or do you feel like the assignment has been completed, that you've dived into this as deep as you want to, and you're going to let the experience ride out?
This one is hands down one of the hardest movies for me to go back to. And again, I'll say it again. It's not a bad movie. It's a brilliant movie. It's a brilliant example of filmmaking in some extent. But it is hard for entertainment value to go back to it. It's hard to just sit and watch it without an analytical eye. So as research, this is a great movie to go to. But as a casual watch, it's a hard movie to go back to.
And see, that's interesting because I watched it twice and I could easily watch it again. It's just something about, like, it's a ride for me, and that's the way I look at it. And that's where you and I differ in some movies, and that's great. Like, I think that is where sometimes arguments go in circles, where it's like, okay, we were forgetting that people do watch and appreciate films differently. And for me, I think this movie's a trip, just the way I think, like, really outlandish, obscure movies from the 70s and Swedish erotica. They're not people's favorite genres, but there's something about them. I'm just like, dude, this is a lot of fun, and I could totally watch this again. I like the fact that I'm watching something weird and something different. And I could, like I said, I could watch it again tomorrow. So yeah, I just wanted to know your opinion on that. So like we said, it's very challenging for our critics. I don't think I've seen them be so lost in a critique of a film up to this point. We may see more as we dive into more critiques that we are not super familiar with, but this one, they just didn't know what to think about it.
Naked Lunch was directed by David Cronenberg, who also created The Fly. The fantasy sequences in Naked Lunch are so far out with creatures that resemble talking bug buttocks in one situation, and actually more than one situation, that they are all very funny by themselves. So funny, I think, that it almost hurts the rest of the fantasy, which is pretty good at capturing a writer's paranoia. A mixed review for me, because the picture really splits into two parts, the writer's fantasies and these bug creatures. I can't exactly recommend it, but I'm glad I saw it.
So what do you think about
that? I agree with both of them doing exactly. With Gene, this was hard, you can tell. But I had the same reaction, I'm glad I saw it. And I think a lot of people going through the experience, or journey as we've called it, will be glad they saw it. And I think that's a brilliant way of putting it through Gene. Whether you don't like it by the end, or you say it's not your cup of tea, that's what this movie is. Mm-hmm. But there will be an appreciation walking out saying, you know what, I'm kind of glad I saw that and experienced that, because it's something I haven't experienced before. So I think Gene is pretty spot on with the brief critique that he gave. And I love the reactions that he's giving, where it's almost like a straightforward shrug while he's giving the review.
Do you think that a filmmaker who makes a film to invoke a reaction rather than an entertainment experience, do you think that that is a worthwhile venture for him? You know, or do you think that this is something that should not have even been reviewed by a critic? because that is one of the things that gets me about this movie is that how can you logistically rate, review, and score this movie when your entire career and mindset is based on cinematic review journalism experience based on narratives and nonfiction, and then this comes along and you don't know what to do with it. Like it feels like it shouldn't have even been on the show because there's really no good way to review it, right?
There really isn't. And based on the topics this movie covers, it's a dangerous one to review to a certain extent because this tackles some heavy topics that a lot of people are either going to be traumatic about, they're going to not really relate to, or they're just going to say, this isn't for me, like I said. So this is I think it's, when it comes to journalism, because movie criticism is journalism as well, this one is an important movie to bring to the attention of what to expect. And I think that is important to bring to the show. And with the two critics combined, I think they do a decent enough job to kind of bring what to expect from this movie. And we have key terms like grotesque, talking buttocks, and good filmmaking, because we both agree that this is brilliant filmmaking. And it is one of those, just based on how the movie is made, is a worthwhile ride.
Well, and I love the trajectory of Cronenberg that led up to this film because it almost feels like playful fuckery, because he got a lot of clout and prestige from The Fly, and then he followed it up with Dead Ringers. So he pushes the amount of disturbing material and imagery and content with Dead Ringers, but he's also got prestige with it because he's got Jeremy Irons in an amazing performance as twin brothers. You've got Genevieve Bujold in there too, and some just amazing cinematography and camera work. Getting two films like that out there into the system where people are really appreciating you as a filmmaker now, and then you're like, okay, well now here's my treat for you. Here's Naked Lunch, which makes no sense. It has no prestige. And if anything, it's a slap in the face of what commercialized cinema was of the early 90s. And like I said, I can't help but think that there was some playfulness in that decision.
There really was, because even if we take Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, there is a certain kind of theme to it, to an extent, of some just absurdity, madness to it. And I think this is something with Cronenberg. He adds grotesque visuals, but they have legs and they have substance, not necessarily story all the time when it comes to this movie, but they do have substance and intent of what they're there for. So, and I think when it comes to filmmaking, that is proof right there on his ability to insert it with a need and a want for the viewer to really put their mind into what's happening on screen.
Yeah, I like that.
In a long time of reviewing movies, I've rarely seen a movie that leaves me more at a loss for words.
Well, I had that reaction. I tried to come up with
I admire what Cronenberg and Weller and Davis have done here.
Right.
It's a very good job. It is a brilliant job. It is one of the most unpleasant movies I've ever seen, and I hated most of it. I was repelled by William Burroughs, this low-talking guy with a monotone who tries to kind of keep a straight face while he realizes that he's totally hallucinating on everything in his life. Even his wife reappears to him. I hated the, as you so delicately put it, the talking bug buttocks. This was not my favorite image of the year. There are many other images in this movie that are so unsavory and so disgusting and so vile.
So he's more on the lines of you, where it's like, I admire what they did to get through this. And I think, to me, that is more important than saying I liked the film. Because think about all of the bad sci-fi body horror movies they've reviewed in the 15 years, 20 years up to this point that they've been doing this show, when this thing came out, that were just garbage in their opinion, right? 0 stars, 2 thumbs down. Let's not even talk about it. But this is something that they just don't know how to describe, because they can tell that it's well made, it's well done, and it's causing reactions in them emotionally and physically that they don't understand, and they don't like it as a film, but they like what they see the process of getting put on film was. And I think that's such a compliment, in my opinion, to the filmmaker and to the actors that these people went out of their comfort zones, out of their boundaries, out of the boundaries of cinema at the time, and made something so grotesque and outlandish, yet they can't say that it's bad. To me, that is a bigger compliment than a thumbs up.
You are right. But Roger sounded so sad describing this movie. It's like he just walked out of the movie theater, went to this show, and he didn't know how to express his feelings on this movie. He went technical with it because, again, there's no argument about the filmmaking here, and that's what he stuck to. But when it gets to kind of what I spoke to earlier, the dangerous aspects of it, of what this movie is about, and how it is so all over the map of anybody, how they're going to feel walking out of this movie. So I think when it comes to reporting a review on this movie, it's a safe review where you can talk about the technical aspects of it, but how it made him feel and the ugliness. That's the theme of these reviews: is it's bizarre, it's ugly, it's grotesque. He hated every moment of it, even though his written review was 2.5. He stayed in the middle. He played it safe, just like what he's verbalizing here. So to me, I think this one is a safe review from Roger, but at the same time, I think it's a decent summary of what to expect, and it's going to encourage people to go see this movie. He shouted exactly what he liked about this movie, and his final exclamation point on this movie is that it is just so ugly, bizarre, gross, whatever it may be. And that's going to be the encouragement to send people to this movie. So it's almost a backhanded compliment.
I'm at a loss. I can't deny the artistry and talent of the movie, and I can't say that I liked it at all. I was really
well, let me push it.
pushed away by it.
But that's the same review you gave to The Last Boy Scout, and you gave that thumbs up. So what are you giving this?
It's a lot of difference. We could do a whole show on the difference between these two films.
No.
I guess I have to vote thumbs down, but at the same time with a footnote that I admire what he did, and I hate it.
Okay. Strange.
I actually don't think it's so strange. I think that's a perfect reaction. And, we talked briefly about The Last Boy Scout review when we did our Long Kiss Goodnight episode with the Shane Black script. Again, that's a whole different conversation. I'll not even get into that. So this is one of the things that I think would divide audiences, for one, and especially critics or people in the industry. When you see what was done on a technical level with the camera work, the filmmaking, but mostly the special effects and the creature effects, I'm sure that there's people out there that watch this movie and they were just like, how could he waste such valuable resources on a film that no one is going to enjoy, that is not entertaining? Like, who gave this man the checkbook to do all this visual work for such an ugly, putrid story? And then there's people like me where it's like, dude, I wonder what he could have done with another 10 million, right? Like, there's people that want to see more of this because they recognize everything that it is and what it was made for. And that's where it is very hard for a critic, especially a mainstream journalist like them, to have a say on it. Because at the end of the day, you're thinking about, okay, you're also worried about your credibility. Right? You can't say this is a great movie, go out and see it, and then disgust your audience by sending them to go see Naked Lunch. But you've got to give some credit to the filmmaker, because also at the end of the day, you are a vocal piece for the industry and for filmmakers. That is where I think the rub is for mainstream journalists and critics like this is you have to care about the audience, but you can't turn your back on the industry. You can't turn your back on the artistry. You have to find a place in the middle where you can at least make both sides agree with you a little bit. And that's how I feel this review is.
And this is a movie that it is hard to avoid to an extent, because this movie on the surface level, if you were just to read a synopsis and have Cronenberg's name on it, critics are going to flock to this movie. And walking out, there's going to be a level of expectation of, this is the craziest shit I've seen from him so far. How the hell am I going to fill in my 1,000 words of just pure profanity, just grotesqueness? What the hell was this movie about? So this is where I think there's a responsibility to really stretch that journalism mindset of setting clear expectations of what you may enjoy, what this movie really does well, which will be no argument, and how you may feel at the end walking out based on just a couple different audience or viewers that may feel the grossness. They might have the appreciation factor, or they just might love the fact of watching the visuals on what those meant to them. So this one, again, we've said it is challenging. And I think to an extent, Roger played it safe. And Gene was a little bit more giddy than Roger when it comes to how he presented his feelings. But at the end of the day, they're both just like running their review with a big question mark over it, which I think is one of the most unique discussions that they've had, where they are literally shrugging their shoulders on how the hell we're going to review this film.
I appreciate too that neither one of them was trying to play contrarian with the other, because I think we've seen reviews of theirs where, like, either Gene liked it or Roger liked it, and it was just intermediate enough for the other critic to play contrarian and be like, well, I think you're crazy. This is actually a bastardization of the art form, right? We've seen that. This, I felt the simpatico between them was so honest and real, where they both were like, I really appreciate what they did here. I just didn't get it and I didn't like it, but I can't say it's bad. It really is. It's an enigma of a film for them to review, but also it's a rarity of an episode where those two can have that kind of conversation about a film and not try and pick on each other, where they're literally just shrugged in unison of what this movie is. And so that brings me to my critic review. So I cannot hold this review against Gene, because he was honest and he was very sincere about his admiration of the attempt. But for him, it just wasn't a film that he was going to enjoy. And I can't lay fault for that, because that's just what this film is. I think that was the film's intent, in my honest opinion. So for that, I'm giving the dude a B. I think that he was very honest. He wasn't being hyperbolic about his feelings. It was a sincere review.
I think that's fair. When it comes to Roger, he landed all the points. He, again, played it safe throughout the review. His tone was safe even. But he got me at one key word that I just left a bad taste in my mouth, which is the word hate. I hated this movie throughout, but I appreciate it. In reality, he didn't hate it, because in his written review, he gave it 2.5. It was almost marginal thumbs up. So that's something that I think, based on his review, went back and forth, and it really wasn't consistent on what his true thoughts were. Hate is a strong word that would get me to do my reviews to a 0 to 1 star. And that's not this movie, because there's an appreciation here. And I think he failed to recognize that with that single word. But I am going to give him a little bit of credit of he nailed the footnote, the appreciation of it. So I'm going to match his review when it comes to his written review of this film. And I'm going to be barely below his at 2 stars.
Okay, that's interesting. See, I interpreted that a little bit different. I took it as he didn't hate the film as much as he hated the way it made him feel, yet he was grateful for the experience. I could just say the same thing about like certain roller coasters I've been on. Like, I hated going through it, but I was appreciative of the experience afterwards, because it made me feel like a changed person. And I feel like that's what this film kind of does, where it's like, I can tell he was squirming in his seat watching this movie, and he hated the reactions that his body and mind were giving to the visions on the screen. But at the end of the day, he was like, but I can't help that I admired what the filmmakers did, and I'm glad that I saw it. So that's the way I interpreted that, where it's like, I hated the experience, but I appreciate the fact that I experienced it.
If it wasn't for the tone of his voice, like he had a gun to his head, I would buy into that. But it just wasn't believable to an extent. And even though the words made it seem that way, I just couldn't buy into that. And based on the contradiction of his written review, it was hard to get a legitimate answer from him. And again, this is the key movie, even with critics, to normal viewer, that is really there's not going to be a right answer to this, just like most movies, but this one even more so, that's going to be completely up for interpretation on how you feel. So this one, again, is a tough one that really is going to have we always say that movies are the great debate, and this one, there's really no debate to it. It's literally conversations with question marks of how did this movie make you feel versus what did you think of this movie?
So this movie is 24 years old, roughly 34 years old. I can honestly say that I can't think of a film that makes me feel the way that this one did, that I actually appreciate both the attempt and the entertainment factor of like what it does for being so outlandish. I've seen films try to be different. We both talked about Skinamarink in the past. We've talked about other experimental films. I'd say that maybe even Train Spotting at the time was looked at as, whoa, this is so experimental and really taking you to the mind of a drug. It seems tame now compared to other things that we've seen. But this one, I feel like this one was like a peak of this kind of cinema. I haven't seen anything else like it. Maybe something foreign that I haven't caught yet, but mainstream wise, this is like I said, it's an enigma.
It's a complete experiment, and this is one that the experiment, given the box office dollars, I don't think panned well to give us more movies like this. But again, the benefit to streaming, you never know who's going to come out with some crazy shit like this.
But it also got its laurels. It had its festival circuit. It's got a great Criterion version, which I bought years ago. It's like I can't not own this movie. So yeah, there's people like me that just think that this is a very special film. So yeah, this is a great conversation. That was a great conversation between the two of them. I'm glad that we were able to experience that and discuss it because it was a rarity in their form. Okay, so next week I am bringing a very particular movie to the show. I am bringing The Hitcher, starring Rutger Hauer, C. Thomas Howell, and Jennifer Jason Leigh, directed by Robert Harmon. It is known to be one of the most brutal films of the 80s. Again, I feel it's tame by today's comparisons, but just like our conversation of their hate of slasher movies, there is a particular disdain between the two of them for this film, and I thought it would make a great conversation before we start diving into the listener request episodes that will pretty much be filling up like the next couple months of our show.
That's a great pick, and I remember this review before you even picked it, and I can't wait because this is going to be a fun discussion on the movie, but even more so, the Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel review.
Okay, everyone. Well, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Please do us a favor, like, rate, review, give us 5 stars. If you are an older new listener and you want us to discuss a film that we haven't discussed yet, as long as Siskel and Ebert reviewed it on their show, let us know what you want us to do. We'll put it in the docket and cover it in a listener request episode. Of course, you can find me and my other show over at thecultworthy.com, and you can find my friend Justin Henson over at
themoviewire.com.
Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.
See you next week.